All right, we are live. Let me get this shared in our Discord and on Twitter. We can get started for today. We have a very interesting show for today. I'm excited for our guest, Michael Roberts. Happy Easter for those who celebrate. Happy 420 for those who celebrate. Not in the Hitler's birthday sense, but in the marijuana sense. I'm going to share this in the Cosmonaut Discord and get it.
Yeah, it's a particularly loaded 420, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of. All right. So I'm going to have Michael Roberts on to talk about the global economy and what's going on. I think last episode we talked a bit about the tariffs. We talked more on the episode before, I believe, but I think it's fair to say that this is kind of the beginning of a new phase of the global economy. Some people have contested that it's the end of neoliberalism. Some people have contested, the meaning of this, but I do think it's fair to say that there's an upheaval in the global economy, and this kind of era of globalization, this era of free trade as we know it today, is morphing into something new. I don't think there's a move away from markets, market fundamentalism, like some maybe believe, but I do think we are moving towards a new economic system. And I'm excited to talk to Michael Roberts about what the meaning of this all is. But before that, I thought it would be kind of fun to react to a controversial interview that was making we talked a little bit about this, Joseph, before we went live, and kind of talked about it, talked about our initial thoughts. But Vivek Shibber had a controversial interview making the rounds with Joshua Citarella. I don't know much about who that guy is, but I guess he has this podcast where he interviews random kind of left-wing celebrities, and Shibber kind of does the usual wokeness is destroying the left, and the PMC is the class that's behind wokeness, and that's why the left is failing type shtick. Hold on a second. Let me bring this up, and I don't know. Let's play some of it, and then we can give our reactions to this. So I don't know. What did you think about Shibber before, like, fairly recently, Joseph?
Well, I was a pretty solid trot for a while.
Right.
So Chibber was like our favorite punching bag in the ISO. But I think lately what I'll say about Chibber is that I think he overstates it, obviously, his whole his spiel against identity politics. He seems to believe that it can be primarily the left's disarray can be primarily attributed to like the embrace of identity politics, but I don't think that that's the case. Because I was mentioning earlier, there are ways to articulate identity politics type politics through like a class project, like a project of class political independence. But Chibber seems to have made his kind of like his career on attacking this idea.
Yeah.
I think he's overstating it, though.
I think it helps to kind of let's dissect it. Let's listen to what he has to say. They kind of just introduce him here. We know who he is. He's Mr. Political. He comes from like the kind of the Robert Brenner school of things. Like he has a very specific understanding of capitalism.
Political Marxism, as it were.
Political Marxism, yeah, is what they call it. And that's a whole can of worms to unlock. But I think it's important to kind of establish, like, Shibber does have like a very specific reading of what capitalism is and what class is. And he comes from a school of Marxism that was developed in contradiction to the world systems theory school that kind of understands capitalism as a global system. And that has a very kind of that looks at capitalism as a system of global commodity trade based around the exploitation of the core and the periphery. And for Schibber, capitalism, I think you could accuse him of having a very methodological nationalist understanding of capitalism. Capitalism occurs in nation states, and a capitalist country is a country where the majority of the population are wage laborers in the most strict sense, at least. I think that would be a fair description of what Brenner's kind of understanding of capitalism is. And I think it does actually kind of impact how we understand class. But yeah, so this, look at this.
Is critical race theory a Marxist plot?
If a man really hated ads, here's what he would do.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize. I don't have
YouTube. Questions first.
Here, we can skip it, though.
No, it has nothing to do with Marxism.
Trump told me it was.
I know. Well, there's a deeper point here, which is this, that the great con job that the current woke left has done is that it's branded all of this this culture of bullshit as a lineal descendant of Marxism.
Right.
And what's dangerous now, it's important for themselves, because they want to present themselves not as the voices of reaction, which is what they are, but as people who took everything that was absorbable from Marxism, but now adorned it with the most recent theoretical advances. So it's actually now more powerful than it used to be. Because a lot of the population and the right sees it for the bullshit that it is, it's now able to say that the Marxists have taken over the university. Christopher Rufo's book is a book that says that our universities are now run by Marxists. And the result of that is that any legitimate left that's going to be coming up now is associated with this illegitimate woke left. And because the public hates the woke left, despises them, it puts socialists on a very difficult footing, because they're branded, they're painted with the same brush as critical race theory, as post-structuralism, as post-colonial theory, decoloniality, and all this kind of stuff. One of the main responsibilities of socialists now is to openly and vocally criticize the woke left.
All right. So right there, I'm going to pause it, because I think there's already some stuff to unpack here. Like, I think, first of all, I think it's very silly. His conclusion already is already basically like arguing for right-tailism, that like the main priority should be to oppose the woke left, which he defines in a very kind of spurious way, right? But it's just, what that means in the political climate right now is basically like joining the Trump. I don't see how that doesn't translate into like, it might not mean joining forces with the Trump people, but it does mean like aiming like our weapons in the same direction as them right now. And that just seems to be absolutely counterproductive, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue suicidal.
Right. It seems absolutely suicidal right now.
I just, I mean, again, this is why I think he's overstating it. I mean, I think he's pointing out a real cultural phenomenon, which is like the exhaustion, like the people's exhaustion with like so-called woke politics. On one level, you do have to understand like Trump's election is a part of that process. I think people are kind of exhausted by it. I think the wrong conclusion to draw there is to say, well, then, you know, a pox on, you know, whatever, and basically lining up with the right. I think the thing here to keep in mind is that a lot of the people who subscribe to these so-called woke ideologies, like critical race theory, are people who would be our natural allies if we were able to articulate a class mode of those politics. Right.
Because in the end, like, I mean, as I was going to say, a critical race theory is a loaded term in a lot of ways, because if you actually read like an anthology of writings on critical race theory, I think you do get a lot of stuff that I disagree with and think is actually bad ideas. But there's also more reasonable stuff in there that I think, you know, is worth engaging with in a positive way, I think. You know, like and so when I feel like when you just kind of throw a list of like kind of trendy, like hip or whatever academic ideas together like that, like, you know, he goes on a list of like post-structural, decolonial, post-colonial, critical race theory, kind of just throws all these things together, doesn't really unpack what it is that all these ideas have in common that makes them woke or whatever this means. I think, you know what I mean? Like, I think there is a lot to critique within these theories, but at the same time, like, there might be rational kernels in there, and I worry that this kind of approach can be an anti-intellectual approach as well, where you're not actually engaging with the intellectual substance of something like critical race theory. Instead, you're just kind of assuming the public perception and the right-wing understanding of critical race theory is, you know, what you kind of need to accept as correct, and then you just you know, and you just fight against it, and what happens is you cannot, like what you said, you end up lining up with the right, and so I think right there is kind of a flawed approach.
I mean, he doesn't seem to know any questions of organization in his assessment of the left. I mean, at least in this case.
Right. And listen, I think the left should be willing to critique sectarian identity politics, and I do think there are leftists who are not willing to do that. I do think that there is a kernel of truth to the problem of identity politics as a sectarian force that creates problems within the left. I think anyone who's been in the left for a long period of time will admit this no matter what. I think anyone who's been in organizing, who's been dealing with the modern left for an extended period of time and who is being honest with themselves will admit that sectarian identity politics can be a problem. I don't think anyone denies that, at least anyone who's honest and has real experience in the left. I think what people have an issue with here is the idea that we need to agree with this kind of phantom definition of wokeness that the right has kind of glommed on, and then point our guns in the same direction when the Trump administration is using this attack on wokeness as a way to gut any kind of civil rights in general, basically. Should we go back to the video?
Yeah. Let's see what else he has to say.
Yeah.
They're hesitant to do so, and I think the reason they're hesitant is a lot of the socialist left exist on social media, magazines, podcasts, and a lot of their viewers are these people, and they're afraid of alienating them. They're afraid of because a lot of the consumers of left media are identitarians, and people are afraid of alienating them. But unless you start criticizing this stuff, you're going to go down with the ship. Rufo's going to win. Trump's going to win. The battle against the university left, they're going to win it. The battle against woke media, they're going to win it. And unless we're able to say that, yeah, we think this stuff is bullshit, we're going to be left holding the bag because we're a lot weaker than either of these two factions. Because the current left is in organizations whose culture doesn't come out of class building, of confronting capital, but whose culture comes out of moonlighting and do-goody kind of stuff. That left is one that's not constantly disciplined by the hard facts of building something.
See, this is interesting to me because, first of all, Schibber is guilty of what he's accusing the modern left of being. He's not, as far as I am aware, building an organization, is he?
I think he's like very tangentially involved with DSA.
Okay. So he's very tendentially involved in DSA. But wouldn't DSA like be part of like his idea of what the problem is then?
I mean, you would have to ask him that, but
yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't know, because I've heard him like shitting on DSA and saying that it's like PMC and stuff. So I think maybe he does have like, maybe he's, I don't know. I guess, yeah. We can't speak for Schibber on DSA, but
But
it just seems to me that like he is a magazine, like myself, he is a magazine editor. He's a podcaster. His role in the left is building a media brand, is building a media institution and appealing to consumers of that media institution so that they pay him for his product and consume his product, right? So, and he's able to criticize identity politics and still have an audience. So I don't.
He's doing the same thing for his crowd that he accuses the woke people for doing for their crowd.
Right. So I just don't find that to be. I don't find that to be a compelling argument, because there is something to say that listen, a lot of leftists they're only online. Their politics aren't actually oriented in building something that can politically win in the real world, so that their politics aren't at all constrained by what's politically possible. So they tend towards utopian ultra leftist fantasies, and their politics can tend towards just a way of personal self-righteousness, a way to express their personal self-righteousness. That is a thing. That is true. I do think it is true that if you don't connect your politics to the project of building some kind of institution, you do kind of fall into the problem where your actual political positions and actual policies you're fighting for become more and more detached from reality. Basically, that is true.
But is it the main problem? Is it the primary barrier?
Yeah, I think the thing is you can say, well, the American left is all just media people and academics. Well, who is MAGA? It's just media people. It's not even academics. It's just people who support all these media personalities in the MAGA movement. So I think there's a deeper problem here in general about the kind of the destruction of civic life and the atomization of political life into a kind of consumer market for different media, influencers, and so there is something to what he's saying there. But is it really how do we move past this problem is kind of what I would say. What is the solution then? How do we do class politics on Vivek? If it's so simple, if we just have to have the right ideas.
It's not disciplined by the hard facts of bringing ordinary people in. You go to the meetings just to feel better about yourself, mostly.
That's
right?
not true. That's not true.
Now layer on top of that this ideology that says most of the people are idiots. Most workers are white racists or misogynists or transphobes. I'm going to go in there to teach them. If I come across a worker, I'm going to teach them the evils of racism, the evils of misogyny, right? But I don't know if I can. There's a 300-year history in the United States, and I'm just one person. So you do it, and when you lose, you see it as a vindication of your...
So wait, I don't get what he's saying here. Is he saying that we should tell workers to not be racist?
I feel I'm sorry, but I feel like he's just engaging in this facile workerism.
I know,
where it's well, you can't. Well, if you woke whatever, you can't go and tell the workers how to think. You have to learn from them, kind of thing. And it's well, workers have bad ideas too.
Right. But the thing is, but then he says, oh, but then there's 300 years of history, and I'm just one person, so there's no point in even doing that. So is he mocking both positions and saying oh, we shouldn't tell workers not to be racist, but we but at the same time these leftists won't even tell them not to be racist because they don't believe in actually fighting for their ideas or whatever. Which I actually do think it is kind of true that leftists are pretty bad at actually fighting for ideas and actually explaining to people why they shouldn't be racist sometimes. Sometimes they'll just there is something to say there, but again, it's just what is your point here? What is your point here?
Skepticism about the class rather than a failure on your part of winning the class to your program. In fact, the losing is a signal that you're so far ahead of the masses that they still have to catch up with you, right?
Losing means you're right.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example of this. I've given this before. It really struck me. When the current left, as you said in an earlier question, you said when working people vote for Trump, they say they're voting against their interests. But worse yet, they say, this is what racism gets you. This is the misogyny. They're voting for Trump because they're xenophobes and racists and misogynists, et cetera, et cetera. And you saw after Trump won all this stuff on social media where they were saying, I told you this is who they are. Don't come to me. Don't come to me when they're knocking at your door and they take your rights away. I tried to warn you. You brought this on yourselves, right? You brought this on yourselves. I was reading some lectures that Togliatti gave, who was a leader of the Italian Communist Party in the 30s in the Soviet Union. He had fled to the Soviet Union from Mussolini, and he gave these amazing lectures on the rise of fascism in Italy. And he started the lectures by saying, our biggest task right now is to figure out what we did wrong. Why did Italian workers veer towards Mussolini instead of coming to us?
Okay, first of all, like, that's not what Togliatti says. Like, Rob Ashlar actually pointed this out on Twitter, but Italian workers really didn't go to fascism. There was like some amount that did, but for the most part, Italian workers were socialists and communists and trade unionists and were not pro-fascist. Regardless, the fascists were able to win, and the workers' movement was not able to seize power. And what Togliatti was asking was, why were we not able to seize power? Not why did the workers become fascists? So I think that's, that right there is misleading, I think, in describing what Togliatti is talking about. And that could maybe, so right there, I think that's, sugar.
That sounds like a pretty bastardized form of history. Like, my understanding is like the socialists sort of failed the working class movement, and part of the other part of it was also that the fascists were able to get like landowner and capitalist support,
right.
Things that explain like their relative success.
Yeah, exactly. They were able to mobilize reactionary classes and and unify them around nationalism. And the left was to the workers' movement itself, and its leadership was disunited. They weren't able to unite around the program. The Communist Party was too sectarian. Some people, some of our left communist friends will probably get mad at me for saying that. But regardless, I think that right there is kind of a misleading thing.
That left took the rise of fascism as a failure on its part. This left takes the rise of Trump as a failure on the workers' part. That's the difference between the classical left and this one. This one, its instinct is to blame the masses and trumpet its own virtuousness. That left saw it as a failing of its part to bring the masses to its program. The current left will go it has absolutely no possibility of succeeding as long as it has this attitude. And most of it, I would say the overwhelming majority, has no interest in, no inclination to change that attitude, because they're not in the game to win. They're in the game to feel better about themselves.
Hello, everyone.
I think that's enough shibber for now. Because listen, like, they're in the game not to win, but to feel better about themselves. That does describe some leftists that I have known in my life. I hate to say it. Not that I agree with him, but like, it does describe some leftists that I've known. But I want to say, like, where is he getting all of this from? Is he just like reading like Twitter posts by like Maoist third worldists who are like, going on about how like Americans are just all hogs and like, like we're just, all like a demonic nation, like
Americans.
Yeah, because I mean, like, there definitely are leftists who post like that. I mean, I've definitely had those feelings myself with the way things are going. But like I think most of the left blames, the blame hasn't been on the workers, but on centrist Democrats.
Well, here's my thing with Chibit.
From like actual leftists, from what I can tell, have been blaming centrist Democrats.
I agree. This is the thing that I'm getting from him, is that I feel that he's conflating many different groups of people and then sort of just saying, well, this is the left. He seems to be talking about liberals. When he's talking about like the people who are chastising workers for voting for Trump or whatever, he's talking about liberals. He's not talking about, people in DSA for the most part, or, people on the far left. but he's conflating them. He's sort of just lumping everybody up to, like, I guess, present this, this idea of a woke left. Because I've seen exactly what you've seen. Most of my comrades have been blaming centrist liberals for Trump. So I'm not sure where he's getting it from.
I mean, and there does have to be a reckoning with how xenophobic and bigoted a large amount of Americans are. I will say, there is a large segment of Americans. I think the last poll I saw, 35% of Americans describe themselves as pro-MAGA and on board with the MAGA agenda, which is an openly bigoted, xenophobic, sexist, and patriarchal agenda. That is something that we have to reckon with. Now, do we take a moralistic approach and say, oh, they're just reactionary bad people because they're bad people? No, we have to look at the institutional and social relations and factors that go into causing that kind of consciousness and that kind of politics, and we have to look at how to address it and how to struggle against it, and how to wage a political struggle against these kinds of politics, and not just virtue signal and be moralistic paragons of perfection or whatever. That's not the aim. The aim is to win and to win people to our politics. We can't lose sight of that. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about the problems of the American people and what we're up against,
Yeah. I just don't think that the people he's talking about are an extremely influential part of, like, the political process. I don't think that these people are actually, like, influencing anybody. At least they're marginal.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, and when they are, they're part of the Democratic Party, and they're not. They're part of the centrist establishment that nobody really. I don't know. It's just, anyway. I think Michael Roberts is here. I think we've covered Shibber enough, and it's time to get to some real materialism, some real class analysis. Enough of this culture talk. Michael, welcome. How are you? Can you hear us?
Can you see me? I'm not sure you can. Can you?
We cannot see you right now. For some reason, your camera doesn't seem to be working.
Huh. Let me see what's wrong with that. How do I check that out? Let's see. It's just, it's not letting me do that. I don't know what's going on.
You don't have to have your camera on if you don't want to.
There we go.
There you go. Perfect.
Here I am.
Hey, and we got
Mark's the materialist contribution, as you called it, Donald. So a little bit of material objectivity finally got the screen up. So
excellent. Well, we're very glad to have you here, Michael. You're definitely someone that we are very excited to hear about on a very important topic, which is the current shape of the global economy with this current round of Trump tariffs, which seem to be a kind of irrational lashing out of an individual politician more than some kind of systemic contradiction. But maybe we're wrong, and you can correct us on that. And
clearly Trump has got a lot of madness in him. That's undoubtedly the case. Anybody who listens to his or reads his tweets every day and all the rest of it can realize that, or his little press conference contributions can realize we're not talking somebody who thinks in any sort of systematically logical manner. He just, whatever comes out of his mouth is coming out of his synapses from his brain without much regular direction in them. But having said that, to use Shakespeare's phrase, there's method in his madness, that he has clearly in his own mind a view about what he is trying to do as president of the United States, as POTUS. And his view is expressed in the view that America is no longer great. We have to make it great again. And how do we make it great again? Well, in his view, the reason it's not great is that the rest of the world, particularly these other major economies, and particularly China, have stolen America's greatness. They've thieved away their manufacturing industry. They've thieved away their resources. They use the dollar for their own purposes, all against the interests of America. And that has got to be reversed. For too long, previous administrations, Republican and Democrat, but particularly Democrat, have been allowing this to happen for the rest of the world to steal America's greatness away from it. So the answer Donald is proposing to turn that around is to get, first of all, to get money back from the countries that have stolen it. And his method to do that is to introduce tariffs on all the imports that come into the United States. Following his great hero, President McKinley of the late 19th century, who advocated a similar policy in order to put America on top by squeezing up the prices of imports, and in that basis reducing the ability of other countries to take advantage of America's largesse, and force them either to invest into the United States or to stop putting tariffs on US exports so that the US economy can compete. Now, I have to say bluntly that this is nonsense.
Yeah.
This is just a nonsense idea. First of all, the reason that US manufacturing has lost its position since the post-war period of the 1950s and 60s is not because the rest of the world has stolen all the industry away from America. Big American companies, particularly from the middle of the 1970s, shifted all their industry abroad, looking for cheap labor around the world, particularly in the global south, particularly in China and Asia and elsewhere, deliberately because they wanted to improve their profitability, which had been falling sharply at home, and they wanted to give a good kicking to American labor and to establish an alternative location for their industries to make bigger profits, exploiting the cheap labor of the rest of the world. It's nothing to do with the rest of the world stealing manufacturing. It was the decision of American companies to go abroad to do that, precisely to gain that advantage. The terrible consequence of that, and what we would say as socialists in the uneven and combined development of capitalism in the world, that by shifting manufacturing industry abroad, after a period of time, these so-called global south weak countries started to industrialize themselves. And in particular, of course, China did so because it did not allow the big US and European multinational companies to run their industries. They controlled it mainly through the state, and although they took foreign investment, they controlled that economy and were able eventually not only to use the technologies provided by the American and European manufacturers, but also develop their own. And what has been frightening, particularly since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, is that China in the last 20 years has dramatically raised its manufacturing capability and also its high value technology capability, as we know, culminating now in the ability to develop AI models which can compete with the big American AI models at the moment. So this is a frightening development. So it's nothing to do with stealing. It's to do with capitalist competition around the world and America losing out competitively, at least in manufacturing. So, but America has some still big weapons, and Trump still has some big weapons to do something about this as he sees it. First of all, of course, it's still a big services exporter. Trump just talks about goods. He put the tariffs on goods, but not on services. Why not? Because America, professional services, insurance services, financial services, and other software services, all those America still has a big lead in and can export abroad. And of course, it has a massive, great financial sector, Wall Street, big institutions. I come from the UK, and we are inundated with American private equity controlling large sections of our economy. I don't know who's stealing resources, but I think it's American private equity is stealing resources from Britain rather than the other way around. So we have a huge America has a huge financial sector and power, and of course it has the US dollar. The US dollar is the currency which everybody uses. The world gave up using gold back in the middle of the 20th century. And now basically they use, if you like, a state currency. And the main one they use is internationally is the dollar. The dollar is still the dominant currency in international transactions, in trade and finance, and in capital flows, and in the foreign exchange reserves of the big economies around the world. So that's a powerful weapon. Who prints the dollar? Only one country prints the dollar. That's the US Treasury. And they're in the position to control, in many ways, the distribution of that dollar around the world as best they can. So that's a big advantage. All those factors are in favor of the US trying to do something about changing their position, to maintain what we might say is their hegemonic power over the world economically. Trade is the least likely one that they can do anything about, or manufacturing. That's gone. That ship has sailed for America. So their position now is really to use their financial, and of course I've forgotten one other thing that the United States has in buckets, and that is military power. It has the biggest armed force in the world, bigger than spending more than all the other countries in the world put together on armed spending. And you probably noticed that the one thing that Trump and Musk haven't got round to cutting in government spending is, of course, arms spending. In fact, we're now going to have $1 trillion arms spending a year budget from Trump. So this is the battle. The battle is not so much about Trump trying to restore manufacturing, because he's not going to be able to achieve that. The aim is to try and maintain America's economic superiority around the world using tariffs, and ideally strangling, curbing, and weakening the ability, in particular, of the Chinese economy to continue its rise and its power around the world. That's going to be the big crunch over the next few years.
Right. Yeah, my take is essentially that this is all leading the war with China. And that's
yeah.
Maybe some people think I'm paranoid for believing this, but so do you agree with me on that?
Well, I think so, Donald. I mean, you may be paranoid, but I have noticed that most of the Trump administration advisors are paranoid about this. It's what they all talk about. They spent not just the Trump administration, the Biden administration before.
Right. There's a bipartisan consensus.
Trump won before that. This is the bipartisan strategy of American imperialism and the elite in America. Their task, their aim, is to reduce and weaken Chinese economic power, not only in the region by surrounding them with military bases and forces and the rest of it, but also economically, ideally, to weaken them sufficiently. So, which is the one country which hasn't had a pause on the Trump tariffs, the 90-day pause, which the rest of us in the UK, where we're quietly accepting anything Trump says from the government, everybody else is getting a pause at least for 90 days on the tariffs. But no, China isn't. China's had it increased to 145% and more on every Chinese export into the US. So it's clear where the direction of this particular approach to turning things around for America is taking place. So if you're paranoid, then I think the US elite, whether it doesn't matter what political persuasion, is doubly paranoid. It's paranoid on steroids when it comes to the question of China. That as far as they're concerned, China has to be defeated. They defeated the Soviet Union eventually by 1990, in some sense. Now the next task, and this is a much more difficult task, is to defeat China economically, politically, and militarily.
Right. I think maybe you want to ask something next, but real quick. I think with the Soviet Union, like, there was never really a threat that they were going to be a competitive manufacturer with the U.S., at least in its lifetime. Whereas now, as you point out,
at all. No.
But you pointed out in your Weekly Worker article that China is now able to import goods that are competitively priced and quality-wise with U.S. goods. And so when you look at that, and you look at the fact that the U.S. military's official policy is that no peer competitor with U.S. manufacturing can arise, it does kind of make this trade war and hot war eventually kind of seem inevitable now. And It kind of does make all of this madness look a little more rational in the broader scheme of history, I guess.
And the other part of it, apart from the actual trade war, is the technology war. I mean,
Right.
you get the sanctions on semiconductors, chips, Chinese technology. So they introduced massive tariffs on Chinese technology imports, and also not allowing them at all any technologies. But in the case of Apple and iPhones, Trump had to reverse that within a few days, because presumably a certain person from Apple phoned him up and said, "Look, do you know if you do this, that the price of iPhones to American consumers will double or triple? How well is that going to go down?" Because unfortunately, consumer electronics that Americans buy from Walmart or wherever they buy it from, 35% of it comes from China, and particularly the things like consumer electronics that people want to buy. China is a major importer, exporter of that into the US, and the point is, it's not China that's exporting that into the US. It's American companies based in China, based in Vietnam, based in Cambodia, based in other countries in Asia, who are exporting this into the US because they went there, remember, 20 or 30 years ago, and they've developed those, and that's why it's being imported back in. So Trump has had to reverse that policy. He's had to exempt iPhone from import tariffs. But lots of other Chinese exports remain heavily tariffed as of today. We shall see how long that lasts. And that is going to mean that American households, when they go shopping to buy anything, probably 30 or 40% of what they buy, it's got Chinese input into it. They're going to find prices rising over the next year quite sharply. And we'll see how whether Trump can stand the popularity of that as we go towards the midterm elections.
Yeah. So, Mike, I wanted to ask you related to that, because in the past, if we recall, the first Trump administration, he passed tariffs that he relatively quickly walked back on after it had effects on, financial markets and whatnot. I guess my question would be, since we all acknowledge that Trump is not being a systematic thinker here, what has been the reaction of the capitalist class, like, the capitalist institutions, and what do they think about this?
Well, I think I'm reminded of Inauguration Day, when all the big moguls of the Magnificent Seven media companies were given a pride place up front, in standing there all together in one group, an opportunity probably that we've never seen before in one group. And it was clear in their minds, I think, that Trump was going to be the man for them. He was going to enable them to sharply increase their profits. He was going to do something about reducing China's competition in the technology area, and the technology sanctions they're keen on, as far as they're concerned, in order to give them the chance to maintain their competitive position. But I think they've been seriously shocked since, because they're dealing with somebody who clearly had a complete, not only that, maybe he had the idea of sanctions on technology, but he had a load of other things which is severely damaging to the top companies in the US. And they've seen very sharp falls in their share prices since Trump introduced that tariff. The biggest loser has been Tesla and Elon Musk himself, who's lost billions in days. It's all paper billions, of course. It's not actually money that you and I can use in the shops, but he's lost billions in days as a result of the collapse in the Tesla share price. And remember, Tesla is a big manufacturer in China, exporting to the US. And so far, tariffs on automobiles have not been exempted from China. So he is still taking a significant hit. So I think they were completely shocked by this and somewhat paralyzed. And of the wider capitalist class in the US, in Wall Street has been shocked and horrified in many ways. Remember that the Wall Street Journal announced that Trump's tariffs were the dumbest policy ever seen in American by an American president. That's how basically what they called it. They see it as a really bad move because the Wall Street Journal represents that element within the ruling class, the capitalist class that wants free trade, it wants free capital flows, it doesn't want any regulation, doesn't want any controls, and Trump's protectionism is not something that they support. That's not everybody, because there's a whole layer of smaller companies and smaller sectors of the ruling class, and of course, how can I call it, the MAGA faction within the ruling class, which sees this as great. They're with Trump all the way on doing this. So I think the capitalist class and the ruling groups in the US are split on this. The financial sector and the big boys are shocked and against it, but don't know what to do about it. At the moment, they can't seem to. In the old days, when things were normal, quotes, what would happen is that the big companies would get lobbyists and they would go to the politicians in Congress and in the White House and they would lobby them to get their policies introduced or in legislation put through. Now that's gone, because now there's a group of MAGA oligarchs who are actually in the government. They're not being lobbied, they're running it. And the rest of the ruling class is shocked to find this split, and they don't know quite how to handle this at the moment. And that's what we have, that sort of stunning. Just to say, guys, that we had a sort of a similar experience in the UK when we had Brexit. If you remember that back in the 2016, the UK had a referendum to decide whether to stay in the European Union or leave it. The ruling class party in Britain, the Conservative Party, was split. The rank and file had gone MAGA, they'd gone wild, and they wanted to get away from Europe. They saw Europe as the enemy. They wanted protectionism. They wanted immigrants to stop. Very similar policies to MAGA. The ruling leadership were against that and wanted to maintain their position with the City of London and to go into Europe. But they lost that referendum narrowly, but they lost it, a bit like Trump won narrowly, but he won. And that produced a complete confusion on the part of the ruling groups in the UK, who then found themselves outside of Europe, which has been a disaster for the UK economy. So we have a similar sort of thing going on. Lots of sections of the ruling class, usually the smaller sections or just individual oligarchs working with Trump, and the vast broad sections of the ruling class completely in consternation. I'm not sure how to handle this. That's how I see it anyway. It's the start of, that's just how fascism started, I would say, that the split developed in the ruling class and the smaller sections of the capitalist class went in a direction of fascism. We're seeing elements of that to some extent now, as you know, with apparently people can be arrested on the street and thrown out of the country without even talking about it. European and Canadian tourists whose visas haven't been quite right suddenly found themselves in detention centres with 80 people in a room if only for a few weeks. We've got stories in the UK newspapers about these shocked English tourists who find that they've spent not a holiday but 6 weeks in a detention centre eating gruel because their visa was slightly out of tune. This is the sort of thing that's going on. And what is the courts in America doing about this? Absolutely nothing. They're either agreeing with Trump or not actually, if they even disagree and say, no, we're not, this is wrong, you're illegal, Trump's just ignoring them. How long will this situation continue?
Right. And I think what's interesting, though, is because you do see, elements, I guess, of fascism, but at the same time, it's not really in reaction to a rising workers' movement. It seems to be more in reaction to a decline of the U.S. as a hegemonic state.
Yep.
And so it seems to be more of that the ruling class is kind of just eating itself alive, maybe, rather than because I mean, it's hard to say that the working class is really organized as an independent collective force in American politics at this point. I think there's
I agree. It's not. We know that the percentage of American workers in organized trade unions is really quite tiny now, under 10%.
Yeah, I mean, there's more Americans identified with the MAGA movement than are part of trade unions by far.
It would appear so at the moment. Yeah, I mean, this is the idea that in their minds that what's wrong with America is what Trump says, not big business and Wall Street exploiting them to death and making it possible through legislation for them to organize. No, that's not what's wrong. The reason they're paying house prices are ridiculously high, that they don't have decent health care, that the education system is in decline, that there are potholes and bridges falling down all over the place, is apparently due to the Chinese stealing all our resources, and above all, bunches of immigrants coming into the US and ruining the economy. This is, of course, nonsense, because actually immigrants have contributed dramatically to it. If there hadn't been any immigration in the last 5 years, the American economy would have gone down, not up, because immigrants have contributed so much to growth of the GDP, if you want to measure it that way, in the last 5 years. But nevertheless, because there hasn't been a clear alternative presented to these ideas, they have gained some sort of traction, and the Labour movement remains somewhat unable to combat it.
Right, exactly. And I think we were kind of talking about this right before you came on, and the fact that it really is a failure of centrist liberalism, more so than a failure of the left. But I think in the extent it's a failure of the left, is a failure because the left hasn't been able to cohere any kind of real alternative to lead the masses and provide an alternative to the needs of workers. So I think there is a sense with the MAGA movement. I do pay attention to what these people think, and there is a sense in which they do actually believe that they are willing to pay more for goods in the name of nationalism. Like, they will say this. I don't know if they will actually do when it actually happens. I don't know if they actually live by it, but they will say that they are happier to pay more for goods if it means less immigration and more manufacturing in America. Like, it does seem like there is, amongst this kind of petty bourgeois lumpen nationalism, has overtaken a part of the MAGA movement, and it can't simply. There is a part of like MAGA that does go against the kind of raw business interest wing of MAGA that Trump kind of has to.
You're absolutely right. I think so. That there is that it's a hardcore MAGA is not going to change that point of view. The mass of people working people and middle class people who may have voted for Trump in 24, that's a different. Right. We shall see what happens when they get hit economically with their living standards and so on. But there's always going to be this hardcore MAGA group now. It's solidified into a, if you want to call it, a Trump cult, and whatever.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very cult-like, to be honest.
It reminds me. I don't know if it's true, that in the American newspapers you've had this measles epidemic in Texas because your health secretary thinks that vaccinating for measles is a bad idea, and I don't know, they should drink orange juice or something. I forget what he says, but I know there was one couple who were strong MAGA Trump supporters, and their child died from measles, and they were asked about this. Well, doesn't this change your view? They said, no. We still think that it's wrong to vaccinate for people for measles. What about your child? Well, that's the price we have to pay in order to stick to our view. This is the extreme example of a cult-like view, isn't it? It
really is. Yeah, it's the total irrationalism. That's another parallel with fascism. That's very disturbing. It's just the complete disregard.
That's not too horrible about this. This is still a tiny minority. It's a minority of people who are actively thinking about politics. Even amongst the activists, it's a minority. And also amongst the mass of the working class, it's a tiny minority. I'm not saying minorities can drive majorities, of course.
Right.
Small wheels drive large ones, but it's still a minority. It's not decided that this sort of idea is going to dominate American politics over the next 5 years.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that there is hope that the political winds can shift if the left is smart, if we play things smart. Joseph, do you want to maybe discuss China a little bit? Because I think the role of China is something that I find in your writings is a very interesting topic that you cover a lot, Michael.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask actually that because you mentioned before that the U.S. still has tools or weapons in its belt, but the way that I see these, like this trade war, actually undermining several of those weapons. Like, for example, what do you see? Do you not see the trade war actually undermining or accelerating the United States' relative decline from hegemony, or the threat of the dollar as a reserve currency?
Yeah, I think there's certainly something in that, because it's clear. I mean, China is not going to be browbeaten by these tariffs. They've been preparing for this for some time. They knew it was going to happen, and they've also got a very strong position. They've improved their position in all the areas of technology, and of course, they're the dominant manufacturing power in the world, with 35% of world manufacturing comes from China. US ratio is about 16%, still second, but still now way behind China. China is the dominant manufacturing power. That's not going to change unless the Chinese regime would fall. And even then, it wouldn't change immediately. But they're in a very powerful position on the economic front and on the trade front, I think, to resist these tariff measures. And we have to think of it this way. If these tariffs are kept on for Chinese goods, then two things will happen. First of all, American households will suffer badly in increased prices, or in scarcity, that these items will just no longer be available, and they will either have to look for alternatives at a much higher price, or they just aren't there. That's the one end of it. The other end is that the Chinese have a great ability to switch their exports to other areas in the world, because they're producing technology and manufacturing everybody wants. In particular, take motor vehicles, autos, and particularly electric vehicles. They are now the leading motor vehicle manufacturer in the world, and in particular with EVs. They dominate. Americans don't see Chinese EVs. In Britain, we do see them, and in Europe a lot. They are very, very powerful competitors to Tesla and other EVs in the West, and they are beginning to dominate increasingly world markets. They already dominate the Chinese market by a long way. So and the Chinese market is not small. That's another factor. We're talking about 1.4 billion people, 4 times larger than the US. Yes, their GDP per person is still way below the average American's living standards, but they're dramatically improving that, and therefore there's a huge market for Chinese manufacturers to sell at home, and they can also divert their resources elsewhere. It's not so easy for the US to divert the exports that Chinese will cut off from them. But what are the main US exports to China? It's agriculture, farming products like soybeans and so on, which Chinese use for cattle feed, pig feed, and so on. Yeah, it's a big resource, fertilizers and things of that sort, and also a certain range of minerals or manufacturers that US has. But those can be found elsewhere. China can get its agricultural imports from Brazil, from Argentina, from other parts of Latin America, and it's dramatically increasing that. So it can switch its import needs to other countries, and it can export elsewhere. That position, on the whole, doesn't apply to the US. So, as I said before, the trade weapon that Trump is using is not going to work. It's not going to succeed in kowtowing China or reducing its economic power in the world. He needs other weapons to do that. We've talked about some of them. Now, I think what Joseph's also getting at is, does that mean that if he can't do that and the US continues to weaken in this situation, does that mean also not only that China and other countries will switch to export elsewhere, but they'll also use the dollar less. They'll buy things in other currencies, or they'll sell their goods in renminbi or in other currencies, and they won't use the dollar for international transactions. Well, yes, to some extent that's the case, and I think that there's been a slow burn thing going on already for some time. If we look at the share of the dollar in international trade, it used to be about 70%. Now it's 58%. So it's slowly come down. So there is clearly other currencies being used, but the other currencies are the pound, the euro, the renminbi, the yen. They're still relatively small. Then you have other small currencies like the Australian dollar and so on. So there isn't one big rival to the US dollar. There's a series of small currency shares which don't really compete with the US dollar. So now other people say, well, what will happen is that the countries that are resisting US control, the BRICS as they're called, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now a number of other countries have joined this grouping, this loose grouping, which includes India, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. Other countries are joining up into the BRICS.
Vietnam is trying to join up, right?
Yeah. So these countries are joining into a loose grouping. Some people say, well, this is an indication that perhaps there'll be an alternative force in the world, not only in trade, but in finance. They'll have their own banks and perhaps in an alternative currency. Well, yes, it's a sign of resistance to American imperialism, but I'm not convinced that they're able to bring themselves together in one coherent grouping. Which
right.
I mean, just think about it, Joseph and Donald. Who's in this BRICS? On the one hand, we have Russia, which is fighting a war in Ukraine, led by a dictator. In another country, we have South Africa, which is on its knees economically, can do little or nothing. We have Egypt, a military dictatorship, which Trump thinks is a great place. We have Saudi Arabia. This is a force for progressive change in the world. I think not. We have a very diverse force here. Even Brazil, which you could claim, or India, which you could claim are democracies. India is led by an ex-fascist, a regime which clearly has its own independent policies, is not that keen on cooperating with other people. And Brazil really is in no position in the backyard of the US to play a role of resistance on its own. So I'm not convinced that this grouping is going to really defeat US hegemony, but it does show the trends or the alternatives that Joseph pointed out to the aims of US imperialism to try and regain complete hegemony over the rest of the world.
I think we should get to the situation in Europe, the defense situation in Europe soon. But I think we wanted to talk about, like the character of, I guess, economic development in China. You read a lot of interesting things about, the Chinese mode of production, as it were, or the Chinese system. Whether it's capitalist or socialist or something else entirely.
Yeah. Well, this is a big debate amongst, it's a big debate amongst academic socialists, I suppose.
Right.
And when we get down to practicalities, perhaps it's not such a controversial thing, but it's nevertheless very important. First of all, let's consider the question. Something is clearly going on in China that doesn't go on elsewhere.
Right.
No other country in the world has gone from dire poverty in 1980 to a position where over 1 billion Chinese are no longer officially poor, according to the World Bank. And more than that, large numbers of them are even well above the official poverty level set by the World Bank. No other countries achieved that. India's back in 1980 and China back in 1980, virtually the same level of living standards as measured by the World Bank. Where is India now? Well, it's better, but it's way, way, way behind what China's achieved in the last 40 years. So how do we explain that? Now, as socialists or Marxists, we would say, well, capitalism is virtually dying on its knees. It can't progress the productive forces forward anymore. It's It's struggling to maintain what it has now. It can't deliver to the populations, whether it's in the global north or the global south. So if China is capitalist, then it's proving that argument wrong, because apparently Chinese capitalism rocketed forward, and it shows that there's a new way out for capitalism in a different format. So what is this Chinese format if it's capitalist? Well, clearly there's some serious differences in how the structure of the Chinese economy is organized compared to the global north or other countries in the south like India or Brazil. First of all, the state sector is a very powerful force in China. So a lot of the Western economists say, oh, well, 75% of people in China work in the private sector, okay? And that state assets and production are only 40% of the Chinese economy. Those figures are probably true. They're about right. But just think about that. If 40% of the economy is either controlled by the state or has companies which have basically got state control over them, plus others where the Communist Party controls what's going on in them, where else does that happen in the world? Nowhere. That is a powerful directive force which exists through the state, and it also enables the communist government there to plan the economy. They can set out 5-year plans, which they do, and those plans set targets, and the state sector has to try and meet those. But not only the state sector, the private sector has to try and meet those targets as set by the Communist Party. And if the private sector gets a bit uppity and says, well, we don't need the state, we can. Jack Ma is the famous person who decided that he was going to stop the state financial sector, the state dominating the financial sector. He was going to take over consumer finance and set up his own consumer finance operation, private equity style, and who cares what the Communist Party thought. Well, he disappeared for several weeks and has come back and carefully humble-pied. Now, that's not democracy, you might say, but you might also say that it demonstrates where the political and economic power is. It's with the state, it's with not with the workers, but it's with the Communist Party in that state, and they direct it. So that makes a completely different, I think, economic process that's going on in China. Now, you want to call that capitalist? You want to call it socialist? Well, the Chinese call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Most of the West, most of the socialists call it state capitalist or capitalist. My view, we don't really need to argue about the name, but neither of them is quite right to me. I don't consider that China is socialist. I mean, I know what you guys think is socialism, but for me, socialism is a society where everything is commonly owned, where produced on a global scale to meet the social needs of people without the use of money and markets, and that we organize in the direction of social need, each according to his need, rather than on the basis of market power and how much money you've got. That sort of system doesn't exist anywhere in the world and can only, in my view, be achieved internationally anyway. But leaving that aside, if it's not socialist, I don't think it's capitalist either. There's certainly something different going on here. And what you have is a political revolution in 1949, which led to the removal of capitalism and landlordism from China. And the capitalists and landlords, such as they were, had their own army, the Nationalist Army under Chiang Kai-shek, which lost, and they rushed off to Formosa, where they brutally suppressed the indigenous population and established their own state called Taiwan now. So China has been, from the very beginning, politically and historically different from what's happened in other countries. Remember, 1949 was the year that India got its independence. But India didn't change into some sort of complete change of the way in which it ran its economic position. It ran it just like the British colonial regime did before. There isn't really fundamental changes there. So I think that's the fundamental difference. And that makes all the difference. That's why China is where it is now in 2025. And that's why it's a threat to the whole of the Western capitalist world as a result. It's not just a question of its establishment economically, technologically, and so on. It's also a model to a lot of poor countries around the world that there's another alternative to relying upon the IMF or American finance or American banks to try and get a better world, there's another alternative, and China are also providing that alternative. They set up what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, which provides investment to countries around the world to make projects for them in return for loans. They give them loans to build these things, and they've also provide short-term loans. So, the moment, hilariously, Javier Milei, the new president of Argentina, the man who considers himself an anarcho-capitalist, who believes in free markets and everything, is taking $5 billion every year from China on FX swaps in order to keep his economy going. So what we have here is an indication of that's the real risk that the American imperialism has when they look at China. China is a different sort of system, and it's a model which is frightening for the rest of the capitalist world.
Right. My personal, I think I'm pretty close to where you stand on this, because there are clearly capitalists in China, and they do make profits. They do, but at the same time, there's political power. Do they hold political power in the state? I don't think they do. I think
do not. No, that's the big.
At the same time, does the working class hold political power?
No, so we have
I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, either. we have a weird situation here. This right. I like to. I'm going to use a bit of Marxism now. I like to think of it dialectically. That what do I mean by dialectically? I mean things don't stand still. Everything's in a process of change all the time, from one thing to another, and there are elements of one thing and elements of another, elements of the past and elements of the future. In the case of China, what we have is a society where they had a revolution which threw out capitalism, but they haven't progressed yet to socialism. In my view, they can't progress on their own. But so they're in between, they're in transition. So you have the elements of the past, a large capitalist sector, and you also have elements of what could be possible in the future, a planned economy meeting people's social needs. This is a contradictory situation. And not only that, we don't have workers' democracy. On the other hand, we don't have capitalists running the economy. We have this weird grouping of communist people who never were communist in one sense, as I would understand it, but they control the economy and they rest upon the existing system that has been built, the state system and working people and so on. There are factions within the Communist Party. Some of them want to go fully capitalist, always have done. And there's that faction. That's a minority faction, particularly at the moment. The majority faction, the Xi faction, doesn't want to do that. It wants to preserve this particular hybrid that it's got at the moment firmly, and it's got sufficient support to do that. But so it's a weird economy, a weird society, but a powerful one that seems to have a great deal of success. But it also has a lot of contradictions. It makes them mistakes and so on. It's still not what we would see from working class democracy. I mean, we wouldn't. I don't want to live in a country where, yes, I can walk down the streets in China in complete safety. I'll tell you that now, and it's fantastic from that point of view. I can write things on the internet about like what I say about China, no problem. But if I was to form a political party that wanted to replace the Communist Party with a different program, I might find myself in a bit of trouble.
Right. One question I want to ask real quick is, do you think that maybe this upheaval in the global economy, this trade war affecting, the trade of China with the U.S. might tip China more in the direction of a planned economy and kind of tip pro-socialist, the pro-socialist direction in CPC in that direction, and we might see more of a move towards planning and socialism within China because of this?
Possibly, but we've definitely seen a change in the policy of the Communist Party since the late 90s, when there was quite a move towards privatization, getting rid of so-called streamlining the state sector and so on. And then after the Great Recession, and also after COVID, I think the Communist Party leaders have recognized that the West is a shambles. Their option that some of the factions in their party think is great, because they're all educated in Harvard or something and went back to China to work in the People's Bank of China. These people have been proven to be idiots, because clearly that would be a big mistake for China to go in that direction. So there is an emphasis, very much so, on maintaining planning. But we still see the contradictions, that there's planning, but at the same time, there's lauding of capitalist firms in China by the leadership. So there's this contradiction. That process, which direction it will go in, I don't know the answer, Donald. I'm not sure. I think obviously it depends on what happens in world events,
Right.
whether the West is able to exert pressure sufficiently to weaken the economy and then open up factions, or if that doesn't happen, whether the West declines and that will increase the view of moving to a more planned economy. One of the things I noticed was one of the big things that went wrong in China was on their housing policy, as they had a policy that they had lots of peasants had to come in. They're no longer peasants going to work in the big cities. A huge urbanization took place. A massive housing program was necessary from the 1990s up to 1920, over 30 years. Now, what did the Chinese government do to achieve that? They didn't set up a public housing program. They didn't introduce a publicly owned building construction agency to build houses in the cities for rent for people coming into work. They handed it over to private developers who borrowed money from abroad and did exactly what we all did in the States or in Britain. You know, private companies organizing things, organizing mortgages, and then going belly up when things went wrong with too much debt. And they've had to clear that mess up. That's an indication that they're still not clear exactly how to direct the economy in the most effective way. I think it was one of the biggest mistakes that the Communist Party made in the last 30 years. And they're still paying this because of the debt that's left with these developers.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff.
Do we want to talk about Europe now? Maybe shift to the...
God help us.
Well, you've been writing, Michael, about the new sort of military Keynesianism consensus in Europe. I think Germany is recently passed a law to get rid of budget caps on defense spending. It seems that everyone, I see it as a process analogous to how the US is sort of pivoting towards making China the primary antagonist, and Europe is pivoting towards, doing that for Russia. But they're also selling it, like these governments are also selling it as a way of like revitalizing the European economy. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think you're right about both points. That they claim that they need to dramatically increase military spending in Europe because they face the threat of Putin's Russia. If Ukraine is defeated or forced into a humiliating agreement, then within weeks, I've heard it said, Putin's armed forces will be entering the Baltic states and heading towards Germany. Our own Prime Minister in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer, said that Russia will be on our streets within this sort of incredibly wild statements of an indication of what Putin's Russia might do if they win the war in Ukraine is being used as one of the reasons why they've got to increase military spending. The other main reason they've got to increase military spending, they say, is because America is pulling out of Europe. Trump doesn't want to spend any more money on defending Europe. He's even possibly considering taking US troops out of bases in Germany and elsewhere. He wants to reduce his US contribution towards NATO spending because he wants to concentrate on his backyard. That's the Americas. He wants to bring Canada, Greenland, and Panama immediately into the United States, and then he wants to move west through the Pacific towards China. That's his orientation, if such as it is logically. He's leaving Europe to fend for themselves. So the European capitalist leaders are absolutely panic-stricken. They think Russia's about to defeat them, and so they need to build up their armed forces and spend a lot of money. And they're prepared to do this for the first time. All these years we've been through in the 2010s after the Great Recession in Europe, we've had severe austerity. By that I mean we've had cuts in our welfare spending, cuts in our government services, higher taxes. All these things have been applied because we have to keep fiscal prudence and not let our debt rise as a result of the recession. And after COVID, that was similarly the argument being presented to us. Now, suddenly that's all gone because now we can borrow, but we're only borrowing for the arms spending, nothing else. Even the German budget is set so that they now can borrow more, but only for arms spending. They're not allowed to borrow more for climate change, for dealing with global warming, for maintaining welfare spending. No. It's just for arms. And that's an indication in which the European leaders are going in order to try and protect the interests of European capital. Of course, this is a disastrous policy. And military spending does not boost an economy. Yes, it helps the arms manufacturers. They can make huge amounts of money, but most of those are American anyway. So it's the American arms manufacturers who will gain from this. And they'll do okay. And those who export arms, like Britain maybe, might do okay as well. But most countries in Europe and elsewhere have to import their arms. They don't make them themselves. And they'll be spending a lot of money on things you can't eat and you can't make anything with, but simply fire for 1 second, $1 billion down it, and that's gone. If it misses, then it's been a waste of money. So this is a total waste of resources. What we would say, so in Marxist terms, unproductive investment, unproductive capital. And it's been diverting resources from improving technology, improving public services, infrastructure, and so on, all those areas which really matter to people and to the economy. So over the long term, or even the medium term, this is just setting things back. It's bad enough as it is. The Europeans, having blown up their own Russian gas pipelines secretly, cut themselves off from cheap gas and oil from Russia as part of this battle over Ukraine, and now have to import at 4 times the price American liquid natural gas from container ships in the most incredibly laborious shipping process instead of down a pipeline. And this has massively raised energy costs and basically destroyed German manufacturing. German manufacturers are on their knees as a result of the energy costs. And now nothing's going to be done about that. What's going to be done is anything that the government's got to help German manufacturing will be switched to making arms. This is just a doubling down of disaster, in my view.
Yeah, that's a very grim picture you're painting.
I have to say that when we get onto Europe, I start looking at my wrists and wondering whether it's time to give them a bit of a slit.
That is morbid.
Yeah, very morbid.
But it really does seem like, the world powers are lining up into blocks in order to do a rerun of the last sort of pre-World War I period, where we lead up into like a giant sort of global conflagration of some kind.
Yeah. Well, yes. In the West, and amongst the ruling strategists under Biden and since, there was the view of a second Washington consensus. The original Washington consensus was the world would be open, free movement of capital, labor, and trade. Well, maybe not labor, but trade and capital, and so on. And barriers would be removed, and American capital would be able to flood across the world in a free trade environment. That's all in the second Washington consensus. It's gone. Now we have to form blocks. One block is the Democratic Alliance, which is Europe, the United States, or North America, and so on. That's one block with Japan and other countries in Asia that we bring into the block. And the other block is the Autocratic Alliance, which is Iran, China, Russia, and all these undemocratic countries, the North Koreans and so on, who apparently are. So the battle now in the world, as it's painted to us by the strategists, is between democracy and autocracy. Well, unfortunately, the United States now has a president who doesn't really represent democracy very well. And so this picture of propaganda doesn't seem to work very well. And also, it's not really what the blocks are. in my view, the blocs is the imperialist bloc against the rest of the world, the global south, and there are some countries in the global south resisting the imperialist bloc and not accepting it. That's the issue. Whether they're democratic or undemocratic, they're not accepting the imperialist bloc decides everything. But what's happened is the imperialist bloc's in a bit of a trouble. It's not clearly got a unity anymore. The Europeans have been stamped on. Trump has stamped on them, and this has really made them really upset. They can't handle it. Just like Wall Street can't handle what Trump's doing domestically, the Europeans can't handle what Trump is doing externally in foreign policy. How this will pan out remains to be seen. But I think the blocs, if we're talking about blocs in the world, we remain with the imperialist bloc, with its divisions, remain with a large number of countries which are really just at the mercy of anybody. And then we have an increasingly larger bloc, loose, which is resisting the imperialist position.
Right. So what do you make of Trump's kind of gambit to form an alliance with Russia, or to kind of split Russia from China? You know, what exactly is going on here? Do you think that there's any chance that might succeed, or is it
Well, I mean, obviously, I would say Trump wants to get shot of Europe. He doesn't really want to have to do much with Europe anymore. He wants the Europeans to sort out that mess.
right?
He had the grandiose idea that he could step in and get peace in Ukraine with, was it, he said, within 1 day of office?
Yeah, before he was even in office, apparently.
Now, of course, unfortunately, things aren't going too well. I read this week that Rubio says that, well, if they don't sign a peace agreement soon, we're going to give up altogether, which is an indication that things aren't going quite according to plan in ending this war. So yes, he thought that he had a good relationship with Putin. He doesn't care if the Ukrainians get defeated. He's not bothered. He doesn't care if they lose half their land or whatever, which is almost certainly what will happen if there's any agreement. He doesn't care. The Europeans care because they think they have a domino view. They think if Ukraine goes, they're next, which is nonsense, absolute nonsense, but that's what they think. Or at least that's what they say. Whether they think it, I don't know. But but Trump doesn't care. He doesn't care what happens in Europe. So from that sense, he's much more interested, as we discussed already, dealing with China. That's the issue. Now, does he think that he can split Russia from China? I think it's called reverse Kissinger. I've heard it called.
Right. Yeah.
That Kissinger originally came up with the idea of, as it were, pushing Russia into the hands of China or vice versa. Now we want to reverse that process and split them up again. There's no chance whatsoever of that. I mean, it's much more in the interest of both of those countries to stick together than it is to rely upon moving into Europe or moving into the US. First of all, the Russians have experienced 30 years of being refused entry and alliance with Europe. Putin wanted alliance with Europe. He wanted to come into NATO. He wanted to sign all kinds of deals with the Europeans, who just turned it down with the backing of the Americans. So he's had 30 years of being told, having the door shut on him. And so he's not likely to reverse that policy. And the Chinese are far too well aware that what is really aimed at is themselves here. If the split comes between Russia and China, it weakens their abilities. So I don't think that's going to happen in foreign policy terms anywhere near future. And so this is just a sort of a blind hope on the part of imperialist strategists in the West.
That makes sense.
So the Russian economy seems to have been in the response to the Ukraine war, when they were hit with sanctions and whatnot. It seems like they were able to weather the trouble caused by sanctions, and I think that they've actually been growing since the war has started.
Yeah.
Do you see? I mean, the way that I see it, though, is that it seems that Russia is becoming dependent on the war for its economic development. So, like, what could be the practical consequence of, for example, if it comes to pass that the Trump administration gives up on a peace deal in Ukraine and leaves the Ukrainians on their own, and Russia, wins that war. But what would be the actual effect of that on Russia, since their economy has been so dependent on war?
Well, Russia has increasingly been a war economy, Joseph. You're right. What's happened is massive amounts of investment, obviously in government spending, have gone into the war and building up arms spending. They have avoided the damage of sanctions, which was expected. They've been able to get around that by various means, shadow fleets of oil, other countries buying their oil rather than Europe and so on. They've done okay. So although the ruble took a hit for a while, the currency went down, it's gradually actually recovered. And they've been able to maintain, on the basis of a war economy and spending in that direction, to grow the economy, something like 3 to 4% over each year for the last 2 years. However, it's probably going to slow down this year because the world is going to slow down. They're not going to do so well this year. And the other thing is that I think you've got to say that you're absolutely right. If this war comes to an end, a war economy being, as it were, reversed and having to go back to a civil economy based on increased manufacturing investment and so on, productive investment, is going to be very difficult. I think it could well be virtually a recession in the Russian economy if we move into that period, whenever that happens, if it does happen. So that's going to make it much more difficult for Putin to maintain his popularity and support. The Russian people want the end to the war. On the other hand, there's still a majority who support Putin continuing with the war. But once the war's over, if they don't see an improvement in living standards, if employment is not sustained, if there are not good jobs, good wages, which in many cases they're getting at the moment because they're all working in arms factories, then they could be in a serious, the government could be in a serious political position. But that's down the road. I don't know how long this war's going to go on. It doesn't look as though, I thought we will probably get some sort of deal this year, but increasingly it seems possibly unlikely. The Europeans want to continue this war. They haven't really got the money or the arms to help the Ukrainians to do that, but that's what they say they're going to do. And Zelensky is clearly not going to pack it in. If he did pack it in or attempted to sign a deal, he could probably be overthrown by more right-wing nationalist elements. So this war is likely to continue, and therefore this issue of what happens to Russia afterwards is a bit of a speculation. I think it would be a weakening picture, though. I see Donald's had to disappear, and also I've got to go too. I'm coming up to an hour now, I think so.
Sorry, I had to use the bathroom real quick, but I'm back.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm running out of time now myself, Donald, so I don't know what you guys want to talk about. Anything else? Or
we did want to talk a little bit about Argentina, actually. Milei, if you have a little bit of time to go up and talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned Milei before, taking his money from only short term from China's swaps, FX swaps, which is somewhat of a contradiction from his general views about China. But this is a government come to office out of the blue because of the terrible failure of previous governments in Argentina, the Peronist governments and right-wing governments, to solve the horrendously difficult problems for the Argentinian people. Huge debt defaults, a runaway inflation reaching 200% a year or more, living standards dropping, poverty, over 50% of Argentine people in poverty by official standards. This is a shocking and terrible situation in a country that used to be probably the most advanced and high living standard of all the South American countries. And this is the mess that has been produced. Now, why has that happened? Well, over decades of foreign investment, imperialist interference, governments completely corrupt, military dictatorships in the past, all sorts of factors have led to the position which Argentina is in. So the Argentine people are desperate. So they turned to somebody who said, I can solve this in a stroke, Trump style. All I have to do is get rid of the central bank, dollarize the economy, wipe out all those corrupt government employees, and you'll have a country that's clean and inflation will come down. What has he achieved in a year and a bit now? Well, he's got inflation down. He's got it down from 200% 50% a year. So that's an improvement which is recognized in Argentina as well. He hasn't dollarized the economy because that would be just too difficult to sustain, I think, because there'll be too much shortage of dollars. He's kept the peseta, but it's maintained. It's been devalued by 50% when he came in, but it's gradually devalued a bit further each time. So it's still not really under control. But and he wasn't really able to turn the economy around. He sacks 30% of government employees. He's reduced welfare across the board for the majority of the population, particularly those people who are salaried workers. So he's actually given some money to the very poor to build up some support below there. So that's what he's tried to do, but it hasn't really worked. The foreign exchange reserves, which are the key indicator for Argentine capital, continue to fall. So he was forced in the end to go cap in hand to the IMF for yet another bailout, which of course he was against. This is the anarcho-capitalist. He doesn't want to talk to these institutions. But now he's big pals with Kristalina Georgieva. They hold social opportunities. Kristalina says he's doing a great job. And so they've given him $20 billion over the next year and a half to fund the ability to try and sustain the currency and keep the FX reserves up in the hope that the economy will then recover over the next 18 months before he gets to his midterm elections, where he will face real difficulty in getting a majority. He has no majority in Congress, in his Congress at the moment. So he has introduced agreed to the IMF package. The Congress in Argentina has a rule: you can't agree to an IMF package without permission of the Congress. So guess what Javier did? He did it by emergency decree. Where have you heard that before? An executive decision, an executive order allowed him to introduce the IMF agreement, which is now in place. So here we are in the position. We're going towards the midterm elections in Argentina. The economy is recovering from a deep slump, a really deep slump. It still has huge numbers of people in poverty, public sector on its knees, welfare in difficult position, but the economy is beginning to grow because profitability is coming back a bit to Argentine capital as a result of that. He's been making lots of subsidies and incentives to Argentine business, and of course he's encouraging foreign investment. This is it. Will this lead to the economy recovering in 25-26 so that when he goes into the midterm elections in 26, he can win and then continue with these policies? I'm going to leave that as a question mark for us all.
Before you go, we actually have one question from the audience, and I think you can answer this one fairly quickly. But it's my question to Michael is: what should socialist parties in the core do to fight back against a push by the bourgeoisie for a future war against China? Do you have any ideas for us?
Well, I think the key to any question like this is not to raise it from the point of view of foreign policy, but always to start with domestic policy. Socialist parties have got to come up with a program for making America great again for the working class of America, to come up with a program which meets the social needs and could change the structure of the American economy to meet social needs. Things like a universal health service, things like education free at the point of use, including tertiary education, a program for rebuilding homes across America. There are 4 million homes short for Americans at the moment. A program for the infrastructure, which has been falling apart. A program for minimum wages being increased sharply, for trade union rights to be agreed so that trade unions workers can organize in trade unions to improve their wages. And above all, begin to take control over the big monopolies and oligarchs which run the US and, of course, other countries as well. We need a domestic socialist program which wins the imagination of people. And that's the task. If you do that, then you'll start getting the support to dealing with the foreign policy issues. But if you start from the foreign policy, we need to let China do what it wants, that's not going to work. We need to have policies which meet people's needs in this country so they're no longer attracted to the MAGA ideas or to anti-immigration and so on as apparently the solutions to their issues. At the moment, the left and the Labour movement has not been able to achieve that. And that must be the task of us socialists, to try and organize in those directions.
All right. Well, thank you for your answer, Michael. And thank you so much for coming on and discussing all of this with us.
Well, nice to meet you guys, and see you soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was very much a pleasure, and you're very insightful. I think our audience is going to get a lot out of this. I know I got a lot out of it.
Good. Well, thanks a lot. Bye.
I'm sure everybody knows about Michael Roberts' site, but if you don't, he's at thenextrecession.wordpress.com. Very good blog. I definitely recommend you check it out if you haven't.
Yeah, let me bring that up real quick for the audience. Yeah, the next recession at WordPress.com. Yeah, and he's got some stuff on Melee, some stuff on the Trump tariffs. He's often in the Weekly Worker. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything we had planned to talk about today. Kind of a
short one.
Kind of a short one, but you know, it's a holiday. People are hanging out with their families. You know, I thought it was funny how he kind of ended by suggesting at MAGA communism. Not exactly, but he said, like, we do have to have a program that'll make America great again for American workers. Like, obviously, he wasn't saying the same thing that MAGA communists or whatever are advocating for, but it did kind of make me like laugh a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think he's wrong.
Obviously, well, yeah, obviously we do need to have like a strong economic program that will like say like, hey, like we want to take power away from the capitalist class and have good social infrastructure that will make your life better, you know.
That might be one of the this might be one of the few points where like you can see a sense of agreement with Chipper, in the sense that the left doesn't have an economic program. Or at least one that you know, like, that's compelling to people, and sort of concentrating on, I guess, the cultural sphere of contestation, leaves that lane completely open.
You know, like we did have, you know, Medicare for all was kind of like the one big economic demand that like the left could like unite around, I guess. But you know, but people don't even talk about that as much anymore. And it was just like one demand. It wasn't like a full vision for a transformation of the economy. And so people kind of, you know, globbed on to Medicare for all as if it was a vision of a socialist transformation, as if you could kind of like apply that logic to the rest of the economy, and that itself would be like a new democratic socialism. But the problem is, like, Medicare for all wasn't even a full socialization of the health service. Like, it was just a socialization of insurance.
Yeah, more or less. The idea was to obviate the insurance industry, but leave the sort of private capitalist nature of the medical industry intact.
Yeah. So, you know, in that sense, it wasn't far enough. But, you know, I'm not trying to shit on Medicare for all either. Like, I think it was like a good thing that people
Well, people really responded to it, and people still sort of. But what they're really responding to is the idea of like an economic program,
right? Yeah.
It isn't that everyone's like particularly fixated on universal healthcare. Is that, you know, universal healthcare would be a big benefit to their lives, you know?
Right?
And the left should be, you know, proffering more, you know, like solutions. I mean, in general, we would both agree that the left needs to be more, like, we need to put forward an economic program, one that's truly transformative, not one that's just like, well, you know, we're going to take it with the edges of capitalism.
Right. I do think that, like, Roberts, you know, it is missing like the democratic demands. Like, I would put more emphasis on democratic demands. But no, I do think we do need to talk more about like what does an actual economic transformation of the United States look like in the modern day. And I just don't think that itself is enough for unity, because you have to have the question of the Constitution in the political sphere, and the question of social policy as well in play, because they're always going to end up factoring into things. But yeah, no, that was a very good interview. I would have liked to talk a little bit more about Millet, but he had to get going.
Yeah.
But so you good to call it a day, Joseph?
Yeah, I think I'm good. Unless there's anything else.
No, I think we're good. We got a pretty good amount of people tuned in today. 658.
Nice. Well, we'll be back next week. I'm sure a lot will happen in the next week.
We definitely have plenty to talk about next week. The rate of historical change is accelerating. It's an avalanche of horrible things happening every day. We've got this whole fiasco with these deportations to El Salvador and what's going on with that.
Right. Yeah.
I definitely would like to cover that more, because it's honestly one of the more terrifying things happening right now.
Yeah, we haven't touched on it yet, but I also think that it's still an ongoing process.
It is. Yeah, it is. So yeah, I think we'll be doing more coverage on that. I think I like to have someone on maybe to talk about AI. I think I have a couple ideas. So stay tuned, everyone. Next Sunday, 2 p.m., we'll be having another show every week as planned. So yes, thank you for tuning in. Sign up for our Patreon, and have a good 420 and Easter Sunday.